They were all at St. Paul's in 1982 to celebrate 60 years of the BBC. Events like that enshrine a powerful myth that we in this country are all equally well served by our broadcasting services, and that the broadcasters represent the interests of the nation as a whole.
Nowhere is this view more deeply entrenched than in the broadcasters' claims that they are impartial in their news and current affairs coverage. By law, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, the IBA, is obliged to ensure that due impartiality is preserved as respects matters of political or industrial controversy or relating to current public policy. The BBC also has its own long-established policy of impartiality. They say that the essence of impartiality is balance. According to the BBC's handbook, careful attention to balance is one way in which the BBC seeks to ensure that it cannot justly be identified as a supporter of any particular line.
We don't believe those claims are true, and we're not alone. So in this programme, on behalf of the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, Julie Walters and I are going to show you the sorts of things that are uniting politicians, trade unionists, women's groups, academics, and a growing number of other critics in their concern. Over the last 10 years, there have been increasing complaints that in fact neither the BBC nor ITN are truly impartial. Some of these complaints come from where you might expect, professional politicians. But it's not only politicians who have been attacking the broadcasters. There are also large numbers of academic researchers doing so, particularly the Glasgow University Media Group. Their series of books, Bad News, More Bad News, and Really Bad News, are a devastating indictment of the broadcasters' claim that they're impartial.
In a democracy, the ultimate power of decision rests with the electorate, at least once every 5 years, and therefore what they are allowed to hear and what they're not allowed to hear, who's allowed to speak and who's not allowed to speak, what is allowed to be said and what is not allowed to be said, becomes the raw material upon which a society forms its judgment. And those who control the media, in both press and radio and television, have the power to set the agenda.
It's this ability to set the agenda that makes television so powerful. Research shows that there's hardly any difference between BBC News and ITN, so we have done a test case to check the claims of the BBC. We looked at the way the 9 o'clock news and Newsnight set the agenda for our understanding of the July 1982 ASLEF strike, concentrating on the first week of the strike. Our disturbing conclusion is that most of the coverage, especially on the news, came from the point of view of British rail management. The main theme became BR's hopes for a revolt against the strike by ASLEF drivers. On day one, the message was rubbed in by dire warnings from politicians. Greatest prominence was given to an extraordinary speech from a Mrs. Thatcher flushed with victory in the Falklands, in which she appeared to question the patriotism of striking railwaymen.
The opposition leader, Mr. Michael Foot, has warned that a prolonged rail strike would be a disaster for the nation. Mr. Foot told a party rally in Wales the government should recognise its responsibility in matters of this kind. The Prime Minister told a rally of Conservatives in Cheltenham Britain needed the Falklands spirit in peace as well as in war. She hoped the train drivers would show it and prove their leaders weren't in tune with the new mood.
And today we appeal to every train driver to put his family, his comrades and his country first by continuing to work tomorrow. That would be the true solidarity which can save jobs and which stands in the proud tradition of British railwaymen.
During that first week, News chose words that were positive to describe BR's attempts to keep trains running. Words like better service, that bit better each day, and so on. Speeches like Mrs. Thatcher's implicitly set the tone for the first week of news coverage, with its regular sightings of a slow drift back to work. In fact, very few drivers came to work, and a massive majority did go on strike. Which would you expect balanced reports of the strike to emphasise, strikers or non-strikers?
Why had a member of ASLEF and a driver for 15 years, Derek Hodges, decided to defy the strike?
Well, Button's getting up my nose at the moment. Those 2 day strikes that we had over the part, that 7 weeks.
February.
Yeah. We lost, I don't know how much money we must have lost. and it proved nothing. They wanted the McCarthy report, and he came out and he said we've got to set this flexible roster in. So why come out now?
But many commuters did manage to complete their journeys by train, and about half the drivers who reported for work today were ASLEF men, angry over their union's decision to strike and determined to keep some trains running.
The public are entitled to a service, they want to get to work, and that's all I'm interested in now.
Do you think other drivers will now follow your example?
I don't know, I can't say. I intended to come in if I was the only person at my depot that came in.
Overall, very little space was given to the views of strikers themselves, which confirmed the findings of other studies of TV strike coverage. We asked a striker what he felt about the TV coverage.
It was pitched at those people who were sitting at home, not being active in the strike, and they relied upon the television for their information, and they still probably thought that the information they were getting on the television was true, because the phrase is the camera doesn't lie, but the camera lied quite well on a number of occasions during the strike. And it did demoralise a lot of people, obviously, to hear the figures that were quoted every day about how many people were going back to work, how many extra trains were running. And, of course, the figures were juggled with to suit the purposes that the presenter wanted to get over on the television.
The BBC accepted British Rail figures uncritically, even though these figures were often contradictory.
On the third day of the ASLEF strike, British Rail say that even more drivers turned up for work, enabling them to run a better service than yesterday. But as before, they were mainly local services with few intercity trains. And British Rail's chairman, Sir Peter Parker, said they were expecting a long strike, perhaps even for weeks. Tonight, British Rail estimated that 800 drivers came to work during the day, half ASLEF and half NUR, and that 1,400 trains ran, 40% more than yesterday. Here's Ian Ross.
That bit better each day, and by the end of the week, BR, losing £6 million a day, thinks the number of drivers reporting for work may be between 1,500 and 2,000, with the slow drift back to work continuing next week.
Later that night, Newsnight gave their figures. You'll notice that each figure is lower than the ones given less than 2 hours earlier. Monday's drivers are down from 500 to 440, and Tuesday's from 800 to 724. Figure it out for yourself, because News and Newsnight never quite managed.
Overall, then, a picture of major disruption on Britain's rail network today, with less than 1 in 10 of the nation's trains running. But, effective as it still is, the strike doesn't seem to be as solid as it was yesterday. British Rail's figures also show that just over 1,000 trains ran in the country yesterday. Today there were 300 more on the tracks, a 30% increase. British Rail say there were also more drivers at work. About 440 out of a possible 15,000 turned up at railway depots yesterday. Today's attendance, they estimate, to be 65% up on Mondays.
The BBC gave 4 different figures in 3 days for the numbers of drivers working on the first Monday. 550, 500, 440 and 601. The contradictions continued well into the second week.
But given that kind of pressure, it was quite amazing that there are only 961 people out of 24,000 who came to work during the strike, which, if you'd have seen the reports on the radio and television and in the press at the time, you'd have thought there were thousands of people coming back to work. But throughout the whole strike, only 961 people actually came in, despite those kind of pressures that were put upon them.
Is that an official figure?
That is an official figure, broken down onto regional levels and everything else.
Of course, current affairs programmes can examine issues in greater depth than news bulletins. In general, Newsnight gave more space than the news for good, solid background material on the causes of the strike, the options open to BR and the role played by the government. But we found that even Newsnight often reverted to the agenda set by the news for analysing the strike. But there did exist competing definitions of what the dispute was about, struggling to be heard. In this example, they were made less credible by a reference to them as conspiracy theories.
The working class and the trade union movement in this country is determined to resist this government, determined to get rid of this government, and we're going to stand fast against any attempt to break the trade union movement. That's what this dispute's all about, and let that message go forth this morning. ASLEF, we're going to win!
Les Huckfield MP, ASLEF's parliamentary spokesman, was the prime mover behind today's meeting. But his sentiments were amply reinforced by his colleague, the Derbyshire MP Dennis Skinner. He, like others there, saw conspiracy.
We realise that this particular action is one of many that's been deliberately created by Mrs Thatcher in connivance with Peter Parker, who only works a 4-day week and gets about £50,000 a week for it, in order to smash ASLEF.
In a lot of the ASLEF coverage, the underlying message was that the ASLEF strike was going against the national interest, against what everyone supposedly agrees to, a consensus. If television speaks to us as though we all have the same opinion, in practice it applies different rules to describe different sections of society. It depends on whether you are black or white, straight or gay, man or woman, powerful or weak. TV companies often claim that people complaining about bias in the media come equally from both the left and the right. Therefore, they happily conclude, they are in the middle, reflecting the views of the great mass of ordinary people of moderation and goodwill. But what about those who don't fit into this middle ground?
I'm sometimes unhappy because it does seem as though that within radio and television there's an assumption that there is a right answer to a political problem, and it's somewhere between Roy Jenkins and Dennis Healey. I mean, I think that the media is very much consensus orientated.
Yes, I suppose that the media, like the medieval church, the BBC is in a sense the medieval church, supports the establishment. In the old days you had a priest in every parish, in every pulpit every Sunday telling you what the king wanted you to believe. Now you have pundits on every channel telling you what the establishment wants you to believe. Now, when I talk about the establishment, we're really talking about that coalition of people who are on the right of the Labour Party, who are on the left of the Tory Party, and who centre around the SDP and the Liberals. Their view is the view of the civil service. It is the view of the media.
Mrs. Thatcher has long made known her contempt for this soft-centred consensus. It was she who coined the term wet for those on the left of the Tory party. Whenever these old-style Conservatives do speak out, risking the wrath of the leader, TV's love affair with the middle ground is never clearer. They are treated with great respect and their views regarded as highly reasonable. Here's part of a Newsnight report on what was generally agreed to be a bland 1982 Tory party conference.
Well, at last, the superficially placid waters of this Conservative conference have stirred. In different ways, 3 cabinet ministers, Jim Pryor, Peter Walker and Michael Heseltine, all distanced themselves today from the prevailing hardline thrust of government policies. Yesterday, they'd had to endure Sir Geoffrey Howe committing the government to a no-change economic strategy until the election. And today, Norman Tebbit, the Employment Secretary, blamed everyone for unemployment except the government. And the week's unrelenting pressure from the cabinet hardliners seems to have flushed out 3 ministers to make their position, their distance from the prevailing cabinet consensus, clear. So the flags of cabinet dissent, if not actual revolt, were finally unfurled today. Here's Peter Snow.
Peter Walker's was the most direct and outspoken speech of the 3, perhaps the most surprising too. He was silent last year when dissent was rather more fashionable. Tonight, Mr. Walker spoke at a dinner of the Tory Reform Group, at which other Conservative doubters were represented. He said the Conservatives had presided over record unemployment and a 20% slump in output.
And it worries me that some Tories in various fringe groups in the Tory party, on perhaps the extreme right wing of our party, run the view without apparent concern of fighting the next election with unemployment over 3 million and rising.
The report continued with extracts from the speeches by Michael Heseltine, who was later referred to as the Barry Manilow of the Tory party, and Jim Pryor, himself uttering the magic word, consensus.
Conservatives are about... And he declared his resolute opposition to those Tories who wanted confrontation with the unions or anyone else.
I do not see how economic growth and extra jobs will be created in modern, questioning, democratic societies, except through a wide measure of political and industrial consensus and international cooperation.
The views of people like Pryor and others on the left of the Tory party are treated sympathetically, as are people on the right of the Labour Party, because they are both close to the centre, which television favours. The further outside the presumed middle ground your views are, the more threatening they are presented as being. This has been particularly true of reporting of the Labour Party over the last couple of years, where the word moderate is routinely used in contrast to left-wing. Here's how the original selection of Peter Tatchell as Labour candidate was reported when he replaced MP Bob Mellish.
What is at stake is now much bigger than the question of who is to succeed Bob Mellish as Labour's candidate in what in all normal circumstances would be regarded as a rock-solid Labour seat. For as Trotskyist and other far-left entryist groups take over control of more and more local Labour parties and apparently drive away older Labour supporters, many in Labour's ranks now feel that the fight is for the very existence of the party as they have known it.
We looked at news coverage of the 1982 Labour Party conference and found the use of language was still set in the old pattern. There was the familiar use of the word moderate against left wing, and a new metaphor was introduced involving sickness and health. This report endorsed the view that a setback for militant was a healthy development.
The first day of the Labour Party conference in Blackpool was dominated by the debate on the expulsion of the militant tendency. As expected, the party leader, Mr. Michael Foot, won the day convincingly by a majority of 3-1 in favour of establishing a register of approved party organisations. It's the culmination of months of unease among moderate Labour supporters, anxious about the growing influence of the left-wing group. They heard it described as a shadowy organisation infiltrating the party, not genuinely of the Labour left. But militant supporters spoke in anguish of witch hunts, McCarthyism, and splits which would take years to heal. In Blackpool, our political editor, John Cole.
Militant, the newspaper and the organisation that supports it, suffered a massive setback at Blackpool today, and the Labour Party took what may prove to be its first step back to political health.
This news report accepted the view that militant represented undemocratic elements and went on to talk darkly of those who really understand what militant is about, who are in turn contrasted with innocents.
The leadership wants to get rid not only of the 5 members of Militant's editorial board, but of the larger Central Council of 18 members, whose existence, incidentally, Militant denies. It's also proposed to expel the 64 full-time employees and to get the 8 constituency parties with Militant candidates to drop them. Some on the right would like to go further and expel all those who really understand what Militant's about. In other words, only young political innocents would be spared.
Many critics complain about the overuse of simple political labels to describe complex political developments. Terms like centre-right, hard left, soft left, Bennite, peppered coverage of the Labour conference, particularly after the election of the new national executive. It's not that these terms are wrong in themselves, but that they frequently obscure wider issues. Tony Benn has long been a major victim of this and has become Fleet Street's favourite target for personal abuse. In a short interview on Newsnight on the day of the executive elections, Benn tried to shift the ground back to consideration of policy matters, leading to a moment of slight tension, characteristic of his relationship with the media.
But how much of a political blow is this to the left? Tony Benn is one of the minority on the new NEC. A setback for the left, Mr. Benn?
Oh, yes, this conference, in terms of the votes, particularly of the big trade unions, represents a very big swing to the right in terms of the people who hold office. But, of course, the policy is a policy that will go through on a 2/3 majority. And I would say to people at home not to be discouraged by this, because we've lived through it all before. People have been expelled before and they've always come back. But it is a very big swing to the right, obviously. That is certainly so.
Why do you think it's happened? Do you think the trade unions have seen the electoral damage that they think might be done by...
No, I think probably this is a victory for the BBC, who've been denouncing good socialists in the Labour Party for a year, and you've had some influence. I suppose the media generally, who have sunk to a lower level. For example, the attack on gay people that I've seen in the press recently. It's only one example. I think the saddest thing of all is the way in which women's rights...
The press don't have a vote at the Labour Party conference, Mr. Benn,
No,
do
they have a very big influence, as you know very well. We want the BBC to become a window on the world through which we can see the world through the eyes of the people who live in it with different opinions, different religious convictions. And I suppose the best example that I could give, if I was to give a living example, is the way the BBC treat religion. They treat religion very seriously. They don't say there's one normal religious view and the Catholics are a bit to one way and the nonconformists to another, and as for the Jews, well, they're beyond the pale of Christian comment. religious programs are marvellous. I listen to them, watch the services, I listen to the discussions, and each religious denomination is treated with respect in its own terms. Its faith is presented, it's discussed without bias, it's discussed without hostility, and the result is that people of various religious opinions are able to turn on their television and see their own rituals and their own theology discussed fairly, and then they feel that religion is treated seriously. That is not true of politics, and particularly not of Labour politics, of socialist ideas, and it is a terrible deficiency.
The issues TV selects, the interpretation it has of events, and the comments it makes on public personalities shape our lives. Our perception of what is happening in the world is as much determined by what we don't see on TV as what we do see. Take the war in Northern Ireland, an issue in which we should surely be as fully informed as it's possible to be. The following TV programs have either been censored or banned entirely by the ITV companies, the IBA, or the BBC.
I've no doubt at all that if in North America the media was as involved with the state as it is in Britain, America would never have had to leave Vietnam. And if you compare the coverage of Vietnam, which was very critical and often caused tremendous problems for the networks in America, with the sort of much more toadying, we'll take the government's line approach you get from radio and television in dealing with Ireland, I think that you see a complete difference here. There is a problem that the media, if anything, are too closely involved in the establishment. And the media, I think, have got a role to answer for there, because it's largely because for 20 years after the war there was no real coverage of what was happening to the Catholics in Northern Ireland, that people in my generation grew up not even being aware there was a problem. It was only when violence erupted that the radio and television woke up to what was happening in Northern Ireland. And even now, for the Republican nationalist groups that are actually fighting on the streets, they only get coverage when they set off a bomb. Whenever, very, very seldom get coverage when they set off a bomb. If someone goes along to interview them, you usually get the Prime Minister to jump up and down in Parliament saying, well, this is treason and you're giving a platform to terrorists. And I've noticed that the media usually give in to that sort of pressure.
Whether we call it censorship or editorial control, the result is the same. Journalists and broadcasters, no matter how professionally fair and honest, are inhibited in their reporting. That means we are denied necessary information which would enable us to form judgments about important political issues. Take the Falklands War. As with Northern Ireland, there was massive government pressure on the media throughout the crisis. We asked Tony Benn whether he felt the media were impartial in their coverage of the Falklands War.
No, I think it's very interesting what happened in the Falklands War. At the very beginning, there was a little bit of coverage given to the very substantial body of opinion that was against the war. You know, it's a great myth to suppose that everybody supported the task force in the war. The early public opinion polls showed that a majority of people thought the Falklands were not worth a single life. And at the very early stage, one or two examples were allowed on the air of the formidable opposition to the war. That produced a mass attack by the government upon the BBC and IBA, and then they fell into line. But what the government wanted was really for them to be agents of the government, and news management reached the point where really the BBC and the IBA became the mouthpiece of the government during the war.
Why were the media so craven in the end of the Falklands crisis?
Well, I think that they felt that the national interest was at stake. And I think that this raises a really important question about what is the nature of the national interest, and is there a sort of something in the nation which represents our collective interest greater than party disputes and party disagreements. You can say there is a sort of an England, there is a Britain which does not go to wars in the South Atlantic, and there is a Britain that does. And one of the things that we've got to learn is that there are different ways of being nationalist, and there are different forms of patriotism. And while you have a media that thinks there's only one sort of patriotism and only one nation ultimately, then you will never get a media which has a proper democratic discussion and division of the really big issues.
What the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom wants is a far wider range of opinion in the news. We don't just want one view, and we don't just want the opposite view to what we get now. We want diversity, so people can make up their own minds, having heard all the arguments. We haven't had time to say anything about the press, but we would argue that just as the broadcasters' claim to be impartial is a myth, so is the claim that the press fairly reflects the full range of opinion in British society. What we get from the media is processed, selected, and produced by organizations and people who have an interest in keeping things the way they are. And if you challenge that, you are regarded as beyond the pale, and what you can expect of the tabloid press is to be personally abused and harassed.
Enormously. I mean, everything from having my rubbish collected in a smart car every day so that they could go through my wastepaper basket, which we discovered by putting an electric bell under the plastic sack, and when it was moved, the bell rang, and we went out and saw it going out in a car, to the fact that a flat was taken opposite and the house was photographed, and the fact that my children, when they were younger, were harassed as they left the house, and so on. That is a part of it all, and it's not very pleasant. But I don't think this is a problem for people, for individuals. I think the problem is that by this process, whole bodies of opinion of people who are homeless and people who are unemployed or people who are discriminated against, that their case is destroyed, and anyone who puts their head above the parapet at any level then finds the machine gun is turned on them in the hope that they will be frightened away from doing or saying what they're doing. Now, in my position, I get plenty of opportunities, but I think of somebody like Derek Robinson, who was the shop steward at British Leyland, who made a criticism of Sir Michael Edwards' plan, which was to cut back British Leyland, in effect to destroy it. Now, Derek Robinson produced a pamphlet which was identical to what Lord Ryder, the chairman of the National Enterprise Board, had written when I was the Secretary of State for Industry. But because he was a shop steward and could be called Red Robber or whatever they called him, he was destroyed and he was sacked, and his life's work in that firm was ended. And I've seen that happen to dozens of people. And it is a brutal assassination of those who speak for what is essentially moderate and reasonable change out of their own experience. And it's a terrible thing to see happen. And the harassment of Peter Tatchell had it, Arthur Scargill has it, Ken Livingstone has it. But when you get to a certain point, you can survive it. When you are someone speaking out of the depth of your own experience in your own community and locality, and they turn the flamethrower on you, you can be virtually obliterated, liquidated by this type of press and media harassment. And it ought to be prevented, it ought to be stopped, the right of reply ought to be established, and I think this should cause great anxiety, because it's just the same in the West as it is the dissidents in Eastern Europe. Only in Eastern Europe, say they put you in a mental establishment. In Britain, they call you the loony left. But that same fake medical classification is applied in order to prevent people from listening to what is being said.
That truth may be served, beauty set forth, and integrity of life.
They're weighing in the ladies who ride in the annual